There are floors that were never meant to be walked on again, not because they rotted, not because they collapsed, but because someone, deliberately, carefully, with full intention, sealed them away from the world, buried them beneath wood and plaster and decades of silence, hoping that what lay underneath would stay hidden forever. When a crew of renovation workers broke through the floorboards of an abandoned plantation house in Tensas Parish, Louisiana, in the spring of 1887, they expected to find crawl space. Maybe a root cellar. Maybe nothing at all. What they found instead would set off a chain of events that newspapers refused to print. A county sheriff would spend the rest of his life trying to bury, and a single surviving journal, locked in a family estate for nearly 4 decades, would only partially explain. This is the story of Hargrove Hall, and what lived and died beneath its floors. Before we continue with the story of Hargrove Hall, I want to ask you something. Do you believe that the worst secrets are always the ones that are hidden right beneath our feet? Leave your answer in the comments, and tell us what state or city you're listening from. We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because this story is only going to get darker from here. To understand what happened at Hargrove Hall, you first need to understand what Tensas Parish was in the years that followed the Civil War. It was a place caught between two worlds, the old South that had crumbled and the new South that wasn't sure it wanted to be born. The land was flat and vast and suffocating with humidity. The Mississippi River ran thick and brown to the west, and the bayous that spread through the parish in every direction made the whole region feel like something half submerged, always on the verge of being swallowed by water and mud and time. Cotton had made men extraordinarily wealthy in Tensas Parish before the war. Men like the Hargrove family, who had arrived in Louisiana in 1811 with little more than a land grant and the kind of ambition that the mid-19th century American South seemed to produce in frightening quantities. By 1840, the Hargroves had built one of the largest cotton operations in the entire state, 1,400 acres, dozens of enslaved workers. A house that, by the standards of rural Louisiana, was genuinely grand. 2 stories of white-painted cypress wood, a wide front gallery, and the kind of deep-shaded porches that suggested a life of permanent leisure. The man who built it was named Harlan Hargrove. He was, by the accounts that survive him, not a complicated man. He was practical, driven, and almost entirely unconcerned with how he was perceived by anyone who didn't directly benefit his interests. He had a wife, a woman from Natchez named Clara, who left almost no record of herself in history, except a few letters and a daguerreotype taken around 1847, in which she looks not quite at the camera, her expression somewhere between resignation and something harder to name. They had 2 sons, a boy named Harlan Jr., called June by everyone in the family, and a younger boy named Everett, who died of fever before his 5th birthday. The plantation ran, as all plantations ran, on a system that was as precise and brutal as any industrial machine. There were overseers, ledgers, work schedules, punishment records. There was a commissary where cloth and corn were distributed. There were quarters, a long row of small wooden cabins set back from the main house. And there was, underneath the main house itself, a full raised basement that Harlan Hargrove used for storage. Cotton samples, tobacco, cured meats, the kinds of goods a man of his position needed close at hand, or so it appeared. What the family told the world about that basement and what the basement actually contained were, as the workers of 1887 were about to discover, 2 very different things. The Civil War had not been kind to the Hargroves. Harlan Sr. died in 1863, not in battle, but from a stroke. Found face down at his desk in the middle of what his overseer later described as a perfectly ordinary afternoon. June Hargrove, who was 27 at the time and had never shown much capacity for the cold machinery of plantation management, inherited everything. He also inherited a war that was dismantling everything his father had built. By 1865, when the Confederate surrender came down through Louisiana like a fever that had finally broken, Hargrove Hall sat on 42 acres of mostly unworked land, its cotton fields barely tended, its main house showing the first signs of a long, slow deterioration. June Hargrove tried. That much is documented. He attempted to convert to a sharecropping operation in 1866, took on tenants, negotiated contracts that the Freedmen's Bureau would later describe in its records as, and this is the precise language used, uncommonly fair for the region. This distinction would later become important to the investigation, because it raised a question that no one in Tenses Parish seemed able to answer satisfactorily. If June Hargrove was, by the standards of his time and place, a relatively decent man, then why had his father gone to such elaborate lengths to hide what was underneath the house? And why had June spent the remaining 20 years of his life apparently pretending it didn't exist? June Hargrove died in the autumn of 1879. He was 63 years old, unmarried, childless, and largely alone. He had outlasted most of the men who'd known him in his youth, and those who remained described him at the end as withdrawn, eccentric, prone to long silences and sudden departures from conversations that had become, in the minds of the people he was speaking with, perfectly unremarkable. He left the property to a distant cousin named Alton Price, a man who had lived in Memphis for 30 years and had no particular attachment to the land or to Louisiana. Price made a single visit to Hargrove Hall in 1880, found it in far worse condition than he'd expected, and spent the next 7 years trying, without success, to sell it. The house had a reputation by then. Not for anything specific. There was no single story attached to it, no documented incident that people could point to. But in a parish as small and close as Tenses, the kind of reputation that forms without any one clear origin is often the most persistent kind. It seeps into the atmosphere of a place like groundwater. You can't trace where it came from. You only know it's there. By 1887, Price had dropped the asking price 3 times and was running out of patience. He hired a local contractor, a man named Gerald Foss, who ran a small but well-regarded operation out of St. Joseph, the parish seat, to conduct the renovations that he hoped would finally make the property sellable. Foss brought 6 workers with him when he arrived at Hargrove Hall on a Monday morning in late April of that year. He had a detailed list of what needed to be done. Replace rotted gallery boards, shore up the foundation on the east side of the house, repair the roof and critically gut, and replace the first floor interior, which had suffered decades of water damage and wood rot. It was this last task that would change everything. Gerald Foss was a methodical man, 41 years old, born in New Orleans, trained as a carpenter before expanding into general contracting. He kept detailed work journals, a habit he'd developed early in his career and maintained throughout. And it is largely because of these journals that we know as much as we do about what happened at Hargrove Hall in the spring of 1887. The journals are not literary documents. They're workmanlike, abbreviated, focused almost entirely on the practical details of construction and repair. But in the days following the discovery, Foss's entries change. The handwriting becomes less regular, the observations become more personal, and the questions he begins to ask, even in the private shorthand of a man writing only for himself, suggests someone struggling to organize a world that has suddenly stopped making sense. The first morning at Hargrove Hall was unremarkable. Foss's crew assessed the interior damage, noted the worst sections of flooring, and began pulling up boards in the front parlor, which had suffered the greatest deterioration. The work was heavy and loud and smelled of mold and old wood and something faintly chemical that Foss noted in his journal without explanation, simply writing, "Strange smell when floor comes up. Not rot. Something else entirely." It was the second morning when one of his workers, a man named Toussaint, who had worked for Foss for 6 years and whom Foss trusted completely, stopped what he was doing and called for the foreman. Toussaint had been pulling up a section of flooring near the rear of the parlor, close to what would have been the original back wall, when he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. The floorboards in that section were newer than the surrounding floor. Not much newer, but enough that someone who knew wood the way Toussaint knew wood could tell. A few years older than the rest of the first floor, different pine, cut at a slightly different angle, laid down not by the same hands that had built the original house. These boards been replaced, Toussaint told Foss. After the house was built. Maybe 10, 15 years after, looking at the wood. Could be more. Foss crouched and examined the section himself. Toussaint was right. The wood had been replaced deliberately, carefully, with the clear intention of making the replacement invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. "Keep going," Foss said. What they found, once the replaced boards came up, was a floor. Another floor. Solid, intact, running beneath the first floor of the parlor and extending, as they would discover over the following hours, beneath almost the entire first story of the house. It was not a basement, not a crawl space. It sat perhaps 14 inches below the first floor, a fully planked surface, clearly intentional, clearly old. The original first floor of the house, Foss concluded, looking at the grain and age of the wood. The floor that Harlan Hargrove Sr. had walked on when he first moved into this house, sometime around 1838 or 1839. The floor above it, the floor that everyone had been walking on for 40 years, had been laid on top. The question was immediate and obvious. Why would anyone build a false floor over the original floor of their own house? And the question had a second, darker part that followed from the first. What was between them? The space between the two floors was not empty. There was air, stale, close, with that faint chemical smell that Foss had noted the day before, stronger now. There were, in various places, objects, small things. A tin cup, a length of rope rotted nearly to dust, a wooden comb with several of its tines broken, a strip of rough cloth that had once been dark in color but had faded to something closer to gray. And in the corner of the parlor's original floor, tucked close to the original wall, there was something that stopped every man in the room when Toussaint held up his lamp to illuminate it. It was a small book, not much larger than a man's hand, bound in leather that had dried and cracked, but had somehow, in the sealed air between the floors, not entirely disintegrated. The pages were yellow and brittle but legible, written in a small, controlled hand that was not the hand of an educated man. The letters formed with the slow precision of someone who had learned to write with enormous effort and without formal instruction. Foss reached in and took it carefully. He didn't open it immediately. He held it in both hands and looked at Toussaint and said nothing. That evening, back at the boarding house in St. Joseph, where his crew was staying, Gerald Foss opened the book. What he read changed the nature of the entire project. It also, in ways he couldn't have predicted that first night, changed the remaining years of his life. The book had no title page, no name on the cover. The first entry was undated, though based on context and the events it described, Foss would later estimate it had been written sometime in the early 1850s. It began with a simple statement, written in that same careful hand, that Foss copied into his own work journal verbatim. "I am writing this because I do not know who will find it or when they will find it. But I need someone to know what has happened here. My name is Cato. I belong to Harlan Hargrove, and I have been in this house for 3 years without anyone knowing I am here." Foss set the book down. He picked up his pen and wrote in his own journal. "Discovered original journal. Can't determine if authentic. Can't imagine who would fabricate such a thing, or why. Or how it ended up between the floors. Bringing everything to town tomorrow. Need to speak to someone about this." He did not sleep that night. The morning of the third day, Foss told his crew to continue the work, but not to remove anything else from between the floors without his direct supervision. He brought the small leather book and the other objects into St. Joseph and spent the better part of the morning trying to determine who the appropriate authority was to bring this to. The local sheriff, a man named Dupree, listened to Foss's account with the particular expression of a man trying to determine whether he was being told something serious or something that would, in a few moments, turn out to be a misunderstanding. When Foss was finished, Dupree asked one question. "How old are these things?" "Old," Foss said. 30 years, maybe more." Dupree was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to do about it?" It was, in its way, a reasonable question. What Foss had found was old. The people involved, whoever they were, whatever had happened, were almost certainly dead. There was no immediate crime to investigate. There was no living victim to protect. There was only a small leather book and some objects and a mystery that had been sealed under a floor for decades. But Gerald Foss was not a man who could leave it alone. And as he read more of Cato's journal over the days that followed, slowly, carefully, going back repeatedly over passages he couldn't quite believe the first time, he began to understand that what he had stumbled into was not just old and not just strange. It was a story that, if even a portion of it was true, implicated people who still had descendants living in Tensa's parish. And it raised questions about Hargrove Hall and the Hargrove family that would not, no matter how much anyone might want them to, simply go away. If this story is already pulling you in, take a moment right now to hit that like button. It helps us more than you know. And if you have a theory about what happened beneath that floor, leave it in the comments below. Because we're just getting started. Cato's journal was not a continuous narrative. It was written in fragments, sometimes days or weeks apart, in an inconsistent order that suggested a man writing quickly and furtively whenever the opportunity presented itself. The entries were sometimes short, a single observation, a date, a name. Sometimes they ran for several pages in that precise, laborious hand, describing events in detail that only someone who had witnessed them directly could have provided. The picture that emerged from the journal over many readings was this. Cato had been enslaved on the Hargrove Plantation since the early 1840s. He was, by the time he began writing the journal, somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. He did not know his exact age. He had taught himself to read and write in secret, using materials he had managed to acquire over years of careful accumulation. Scraps of paper, a stub of pencil, a fragment of a primer that had been discarded in the trash behind the main house. He was careful. He was patient, and he was, in the years before he disappeared beneath the floor, one of the most trusted workers on the Hargrove property, trusted enough to be assigned to the main house, to the domestic work that kept him closer to the family and farther from the overseer's daily supervision. The journal opened in the summer of 1852, more than a year after an event that Cato referenced repeatedly but never described directly, only alluding to it in careful, oblique terms that Foss found maddening and illuminating in equal measure. Something had happened, something serious enough that Cato had decided at whatever cost that he needed to disappear. Not run, not escape north, disappear. And the place he chose to disappear was directly beneath the house of the man who claimed to own him. The logic of this, as Foss turned it over in his mind during those evenings in the boarding house, was almost impenetrable. Why stay? Why not try to reach the north or the Free States or even Mexico? Cato addressed this directly in one of the earlier entries in a passage that Foss would copy into his own journal nearly word for word. I know what you will think if you are reading this. You will think, why didn't you go? I thought about going. I thought about it for a long time. But there is something here that I cannot leave. Something that if I leave it, it will be lost. I am the only one who knows where it is. And if I go, no one will ever know the truth about what happened here in the spring of last year. So I stay. I stay and I wait and I write. And I hope that someday someone reads this and understands. What was the something that Cato could not leave? The journal didn't say. Not directly. Not yet. What it did say, in entry after entry, building a portrait of life in that sealed space beneath the floor, was how Cato had survived. There was a section of the original basement foundation that had been partially bricked up but not completely sealed, providing faint ventilation. Water came from a cistern pipe that ran close to the northeast corner of the house. Cato had, over months of careful work before his disappearance, created a connection to it that was invisible from above. Food was the hardest problem, and Cato addressed it obliquely, only saying that he had help from one who I will not name for their protection. A single person, apparently, who knew he was there and brought him provisions when possible, always at night, always through a method so indirect and so carefully designed that even in the journal, even writing only for a future unknown reader, Cato refused to describe it clearly. He had been, by the time the first entry was written, living in that space for over a year. He had, in that time, developed a detailed and intimate knowledge of the house above him. He could hear conversations, could track movement by the sound of footsteps, could tell, with reasonable accuracy, who was in which room at what time of day. He described the rhythm of the house with a precision that was both extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The way Harlan Sr.'s study smelled of tobacco in the late afternoon when he opened his window, the particular creak of the staircase that signaled the housekeeper's morning rounds, the sound of Clara Hargrove's rocking chair on the second-floor gallery that always stopped at exactly the say-me time each night before she went to bed. He also described, in entries that grew more tense and agitated as the journal progressed, what had prompted the entire sequence of events. Not directly, not in the form of a complete account, but in pieces, small sharp pieces that formed, when arranged correctly, a picture that Foss found himself staring at in the lamplight of his boarding room, unable to put down. In the spring of 1851, Harlan Hargrove Sr. had done something on his property that he had gone to considerable lengths to conceal, something that involved several of the enslaved workers on the plantation, something that Cato, in his capacity as a houseworker, had witnessed partially, and had been able to reconstruct more completely based on what he heard and what he learned in the weeks afterward. The journal named names. Not many. Cato was careful about that, understanding even then that the names he put on paper were themselves a form of risk. But there were names and dates, and specific locations on the property, and these details, Foss realized as he read, were not the details of a man inventing a story. They were the details of a man who had been there, who had seen, who was documenting, with the meticulous care of someone who understood that documentation was the only form of power available to him, what had happened to people he knew. Gerald Foss spent the better part of a week reading and rereading Cato's journal before he made his next move. In that week, his crew continued the renovation work at Hargrove Hall, and they continued to find things between the floors, not everywhere and not in large quantities, but scattered throughout the space in ways that suggested they had been placed there over time, deliberately, with a particular intention. More cloth, more small personal objects, a pair of shoes, worn nearly through, that were too small to belong to a full-grown man, a child's wooden toy, a small horse, crudely carved, one leg broken, a tin plate, dented and scratched with a mark along the rim that Toussaint, when Foss showed it to him, said looked like a letter. It did look like a letter, Foss agreed. It looked like the letter N, scratched into the edge of the tin with a nail or something similar. He added it to the collection of objects he was assembling in a wooden box in his room at the boarding house. On a Thursday morning, 11 days after the initial discovery, Foss made a decision that would set everything in motion. He wrote a letter to a man named Aldrich Vane, who was at that time the editor of a small but respected newspaper in Natchez, Mississippi, just across the river from Tensas Parish. Foss and Vane had met years earlier through a mutual acquaintance and had corresponded occasionally since then, though not about anything of significance. Foss told Vane what he had found. He described the journal and its contents. He asked, with considerable care, whether Vane knew of any way to verify the historical record, specifically whether there was any documentation in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau or elsewhere that might corroborate the account Cato had set down. He also asked whether Vane knew anything about the Hargrove family, and whether any of them were still alive. The answer to the second question came back within a week, and it was the answer Foss had been both expecting and dreading. Yes. Harlan Hargrove Jr., June, was dead, but June had a nephew, a son of his cousin on the Price side, who had taken a strong interest in the Hargrove family history. His name was Emmett Price. He was 34 years old, lived in New Orleans, and had visited Tensas Parish twice in the past 2 years, apparently researching the family's history with what Vane described in his letter as an enthusiasm that struck at least 2 people I spoke to as something beyond ordinary genealogical interest. Aldrich Vane was a careful man. He did not print anything about what Foss had told him. Not yet. But he had been, in the weeks since Foss's letter arrived, quietly asking questions in the parish, and what he had found, he wrote to Foss, suggested that the people of Tensas Parish already had suspicions about Hargrove Hall that they had never found reason to voice aloud. The house had a history that was felt rather than spoken. People who had lived in the area in the 1850s and 60s remembered things, half-memories, overheard fragments, the particular silence that had settled over the Hargrove property after the spring of 1851, the way workers had been shuffled and reassigned, the sudden absence of certain people who were never satisfactorily accounted for. None of this was evidence. None of it, standing alone, amounted to anything that could be pointed to and named. But it formed a context, a shadow, the kind of accumulation of small, unexplained things that, in retrospect, always surrounds the large and terrible thing that was being concealed. In the 4th week of the investigation, and by this point Foss had stopped thinking of it as a renovation and started thinking of it as an investigation, however unofficial, he made a discovery that changed the nature of everything he thought he understood. He went back to Hargrove Hall alone on a Sunday, when the crew was resting. He had been thinking about something Cato had written in one of the later entries in the journal, a passage that described, with unusual precision, a specific location under the house, not in the parlor, not near any of the areas where the objects had been found, but toward the back of the house, near the original kitchen access, in a section of the original floor that had, for some reason, been covered with a layer of lime, the kind of agricultural lime that was commonly used in the 19th century to treat soil and to suppress odors. Cato had written about the lime in an entry dated, or at least referenced as, the autumn of 1852. He thinks putting lime there will end the questions. He doesn't know that the lime is what started them, for me, because there is only one reason a man spreads lime under his own house, and I knew them. I knew all of them. I want someone to find this and know their names. I want their names to be somewhere that doesn't belong to him. The names followed. 12 names, written in that careful, deliberate hand, each on its own line, with a short description beside each one, an age, an identifying detail, a word or two. Not an epitaph, something more immediate than that, something that read less like a memorial and more like testimony. Foss stood in the space between the floors, crouching in the low-ceiling dark with his lamp, and read the 12 names. Then he closed the journal, crawled back out, and sat on the floor of the empty parlor for a very long time. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the truth beneath Hargrove Hall grows darker still. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Aldrich Vane arrived in St. Joseph on a Wednesday evening in the 5th week, traveling by ferry from Natchez with a leather satchel that contained, among other things, a series of documents he had assembled through what he described to Foss, over supper that night at the boarding house as the most uncomfortable correspondence I have conducted in 20 years of journalism. The documents were copies of Freedmen's Bureau records from 1865 and 1866, labor contracts from the immediate post-war period, a partial inventory of the Hargrove property that had been compiled by a federal assessor in 1864, which included, in a footnote that appeared to have been added by hand and in a different ink than the rest of the document, a cryptic notation that Vane had spent 2 days trying to contextualize: discrepancy in workforce records, 1851. Approximately 12 individuals unaccounted for in subsequent years' inventory. No explanation provided by owner. Matter referred, see attached. No attachment was included. The C attached referred to a document that had either been lost, removed, or never filed in the first place. 12, Foss said when Vane read him the notation. Vane looked at him. What? 12. Cato wrote down 12 names. The silence that followed that exchange was the kind that neither man wanted to break. Foss set the journal on the table between them, and Vane, who had heard its contents described but had not yet held it in his hands, picked it up with the careful reverence of someone who understood immediately what they were looking at. They sat in that room for 3 hours. Vane read. Foss drank his coffee and watched the man's face change as the entries progressed. The initial controlled professional attention gradually giving way to something rawer, something that Foss recognized from his own first reading of the document. Not quite horror. Something more complicated, the particular weight of understanding something that, once understood, cannot be made unknown. "This is real," Vane said finally. It was not a question. "I believe it is." "The lime," Vane said. He didn't finish the sentence. "I know. We need to bring someone official into this." "I tried. Dupree wasn't interested." Vane set the journal down carefully and looked at the table for a long moment. "Dupree is from this parish. His family has been here since before the war. Whatever happened here, whatever Harlan Hargrove did in 1851, there are people in this county who would rather it stayed between those floors." This was the observation that changed the shape of the investigation, because it was true, and both men knew it. The South of 1887 was not a place that welcomed scrutiny of its antebellum history, particularly scrutiny that came with names and dates and a body count. The war had been over for 22 years. Reconstruction was finished. The work of erasing and softening and recontextualizing what had happened in places like Tenses Parish was well underway, conducted by people who understood that history, if left unguarded, had a tendency to become inconvenient. But there was also the matter of Emmett Price, the nephew, the man in New Orleans with what Vane had called an unusual enthusiasm for the Hargrove family history. Foss had been thinking about Emmett Price since Vane's first letter, and the more he thought, the more a specific concern had begun to take shape in his mind. Price was the heir to the Hargrove property. Not in any legal sense, since Alton Price owned it and had hired Foss to renovate it, but in the deeper, more personal sense of family legacy. If the journal was real, if Cato's account was accurate, then the Hargrove name, Emmett Price's family name, in the most immediate and personal terms, carried a specific kind of stain. Not the general stain that all slaveholding families carried, which the social order of the period had managed to normalize into invisibility, but a specific documented 12-named stain. And Emmett Price, Foss had begun to suspect, might already know it. The question was whether he knew about the journal. The answer came the following morning, in a form that neither Foss nor Vane could have anticipated. Emmett Price arrived at Hargrove Hall. Foss had returned to the site early that Thursday morning before the crew to continue examining the section of the original floor where the lime had been spread. He had been there perhaps 20 minutes when he heard a horse on the road and looked up from the gallery to see a man approaching. The man was well dressed, traveling alone, perhaps in his mid-30s. He dismounted at the gate and walked up the path to the house with the particular ease of someone who was accustomed to arriving at places and being received without question. Foss stepped out onto the gallery. "You're the contractor," the man said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "Gerald Foss, yes." "Emmett Price, Alton's nephew." He said it pleasantly, as a simple identification. "He wrote to me that the renovation was underway. I thought I'd come and have a look at the old place." Foss looked at him. Price had a broad, open face, the kind of face that was either genuinely friendly or had been carefully arranged to appear so. His eyes, Foss noted, moved over the front of the house with a focused attention that didn't quite match the casual tone of his arrival. "Of course," Foss said. "Come in." What followed was an hour-long tour of the house that Foss would describe in his journal that evening as the most uncomfortable professional experience of my career, and I have had several. He showed Price the renovation work. He showed him the damaged sections of the first floor. He showed him because there was no way not to, because the crew had already opened up most of the parlor flooring, the space between the floors. Price's reaction to the space between the floors was the most telling thing about the whole encounter. He said nothing. His expression did not change visibly. He looked down into the gap where the boards had been removed, and he was quiet for 5 seconds, perhaps 10, before turning to Foss with a perfectly controlled expression and saying, "How far does it extend?" "Most of the first story," Foss said. He was watching Price's face very carefully. "Unusual," Price said. "What do you suppose it was for?" "I don't know yet," Foss said. It was a lie. He was lying to Emmett Price's face, in Emmett Price's family home, standing above the original floor that held, somewhere in its sealed and limed corners, the evidence of what Price's great-uncle had done. And Price, Foss was nearly certain, was doing the same thing in return. "My uncle would be interested to know about this," Price said after another silence. "The original floor. It might affect the assessment. I'll include it in my report," Foss said. Price looked at him. Something moved behind those flat, controlled eyes. A calculation, Foss thought, or a question being asked and answered privately. Then Price smiled and thanked him for his time and walked back out to his horse and rode away. And Foss stood on the gallery of Hargrove Hall, watching him go until the road turned and he disappeared into the trees. That evening, Foss found Aldrich Vane at the boarding house and told him everything that had happened. Vane was quiet through the whole account. When it was over, he said, "He came to see what you'd found. I know. And now he knows you found the floor." "He already knew about the floor," Foss said. "I'm certain of it. He came to see if I'd found what's under it." The two men argued for much of that night about what to do. Vane wanted to publish. Not the full story, not yet, but enough to create a public record, something that would make it harder for the evidence to disappear. Foss was more cautious. He had the journal, he had the objects, he had the bureau notation, but he did not yet have what the journal itself had been written to provide, a complete account of what had happened on the Hargrove property in the spring of 1851. Cato's entries were close to telling the full story, but they stopped, abruptly, without conclusion, in the winter of 1853. There were blank pages at the back of the journal, pages that had never been filled, and this incompleteness gnawed at Foss in a way he couldn't fully articulate, because the 12 names were there, the lime was there, but the direct statement, the plain, declarative account of what had happened, was not. And without it, Foss worried that the evidence could be explained away, reframed, contextualized into something less than what it was, a set of objects, a bureau notation, a journal written by a man who, by the legal standards of his day, had not been recognized as a person at all, and whose testimony would not have been admissible in any court in Louisiana in 1887. What Foss needed, what would make the case complete, was something outside the floor, something that existed in the historical record independently of Cato's journal, something that could not be attributed to the imagination or the grievance of an enslaved man writing in the dark. He found it 4 days later in the least likely place imaginable. In the records of the St. Joseph Parish Catholic Church, maintained in a leather-bound register that dated back to 1824, there was an entry dated June 12, 1851. It was a baptismal record, the kind of routine registration that formed the backbone of parish life records throughout the 19th century South. But the entry was unusual in one specific way that the parish priest at the time had apparently seen fit to note in the margin, in a handwriting that was quite different from the body of the text. The baptismal record was for a child named Thomas, no surname, which was common enough for enslaved individuals in that era. The plantation of origin was listed as Hargrove. The godparents were listed as 2 other members of the Hargrove household, standard in every detail except for the marginal note, written in a cramped hand that Foss had difficulty deciphering at first, which read, in full, "This child was brought to me by a woman who said she feared for him. She did not explain what she feared. I baptized the child as requested. God forgive me, I did not ask more questions. I should have asked more questions. June 1851. The priest who had made that marginal note was a man named Father Dominique Broussard. He had served at the St. Joseph Church from 1843 until his death in 1869. Foss found no other records from Broussard that related to the Hargrove family, no further notes, no correspondence. But the entry, that single guilty marginal notation, written by a man who clearly knew he had failed in some pastoral duty and could not bring himself to be more specific about what it was, fit with a precision that was almost physical into the space in Cato's account where the direct statement was missing. Something had happened in the spring of 1851. A woman had been afraid enough to bring her child to a priest in secret. A priest had been troubled enough to write a private note of self-reproach in the margins of his own official records. And 12 people, whose names Cato had written down, alone in the dark, under the floor of the house where the man responsible for whatever had happened still lived and slept and ate his meals, had disappeared from the Hargrove Plantation's official inventory and were never accounted for in any subsequent record. Foss brought the church register to Aldrich Vane. He laid it on the table beside Cato's journal. He put the Freedmen's Bureau notation beside both. "Is that enough?" he asked. Vane looked at everything on the table for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know if it will ever be enough. Not here, not in 1887 Louisiana." "Then what do we do with it?" Vane was quiet. "Then we preserve it. All of it. We make sure it doesn't disappear. And then we decide who we bring it to." The answer to that question, the question of who to bring it to, would be determined not by Foss or Vane, but by Emmett Price. Because 4 days after Foss's visit to the church records, Alton Price's house in Memphis received a letter from his nephew. The letter, which Alton Price later shared with Foss in a state of considerable agitation, requested that the renovation of Hargrove Hall be halted immediately. Emmett had developed concerns, he wrote, about the structural integrity of the site, and believed that continuing the work without a thorough assessment of the foundations could result in significant damage to what remained of the property. It was a pretext. Both Foss and Vane knew it immediately. The foundations of Hargrove Hall were not under assessment. No one had raised concerns about them. The only thing that had changed since Emmett Price's visit was that Foss had spent more time looking between the floors, and that the crew had, in the days following that visit, located and carefully marked the section of the original floor where the lime had been spread thickest. Emmett Price wanted the work stopped. And the only explanation that made sense, the only one that accounted for the timing and the pretense, was that he was afraid of what continued excavation would find. Alton Price, to his considerable credit, refused to halt the work. He was an old man with a businessman's impatience and no particular emotional investment in the Hargrove legacy, and he told his nephew, in a return letter that Foss would later describe as the most useful thing that happened in this entire affair, that the renovation would continue on schedule and that if Emmett had concerns about the property, he was welcome to bring them to the contractor in person. Emmett Price did not come back in person, but his interest in the project did not disappear either. Foss began to notice things, small things, individually unremarkable, that accumulated into a pattern over the following weeks. A stranger who seemed to spend too much time in the vicinity of the boarding house. A conversation at the general store that stopped a beat too quickly when Foss walked in. The sense, impossible to document and impossible to dismiss, that the investigation was being watched by someone who had reason to want it to end. It was Toussaint who made the final discovery. This is important to note, not because Foss wasn't looking, but because what Toussaint found required the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life building and unbuilding structures, who understood wood the way a musician understands intervals, and who noticed, in the final week of the primary excavation of the space between the floors, that the lime-treated section of the original floor was not simply a surface. There was a seam, barely visible, barely there. But it was there, running in a near-perfect rectangle approximately 4 feet by 6 feet, cut so precisely into the original flooring that whoever had made it had clearly been a skilled carpenter, or had hired one. The seam had been limed over decades ago, and the lime had filled it in and hardened, and 30-plus years of settled dust and decomposed material had filled the rest. But Toussaint, running his fingers along the floor with the lamp held close, found the seam and knew immediately what it was. A hatch. A hatch in the original floor, cut after the house was built, sealed with lime, sealed again with the false floor above. A space below the original floor, below the basement, a third level. Foss was at the boarding house when Toussaint sent one of the younger workers to find him. He arrived at Hargrove Hall within the hour, descended into the space between the floors, and crouched beside the seam that Toussaint had found. He traced its edges with his own fingers. He pressed on the rectangle. It didn't move. The lime had hardened it into the surrounding floor. But it gave slightly, with a faint sound of compressed air, as if the space below it was sealed, and had been sealed for a long time. "Do we open it?" Toussaint asked. The two men looked at each other in the low lamplight. The smell of lime was strong here, chemical, ancient. "Yes," Foss said. It took 40 minutes and considerable care. Foss wanted to damage as little as possible, to clear the lime and work the hatch free. What was below it was not large. A cavity, perhaps 3 feet deep, running the length and width of the hatch itself, lined on 3 sides with brick, sealed, airless. In that space, in the dark, in the lime-whitened brick cavity that Harlan Hargrove Sr. had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide from the world, there were documents. Not one document. Many. A collection of papers, wrapped in oilcloth, and then wrapped again in what appeared to be layers of waxed canvas, packed into the cavity with the obvious intention of preservation. The oilcloth and canvas had done their work. The papers, when Foss carefully unwrapped them at the boarding house that evening, were damaged but legible. Some were water-stained at the edges, some were brittle, but they were readable, and what they contained was, in Foss's judgment, the most complete and damning record of a private crime he had encountered in his life. They were Harlan Hargrove Sr.'s own records, personal records, not the official plantation ledgers that would have been accessible to creditors or assessors, but private accounts kept in his own hand, his own system of notation going back to the early 1840s, purchase records, transaction records, correspondence with other plantation owners, and in a separate section, bound with a piece of cord, a set of documents that related specifically to the spring of 1851. Foss read for 3 hours without stopping. He read with Cato's journal open beside him, cross-referencing dates and names. And as he read, the story that Cato had constructed from fragments and fear, and the overheard conversations of a man living in a sealed space, assembled itself into something complete and terrible. In the spring of 1851, Harlan Hargrove Sr. had undertaken something that was, even by the standards of antebellum Louisiana, well outside the legal and social norms of his time. He had, and here Foss forced himself to read the documents with the same methodical care with which they had been written, not allowing himself to look away from what was plainly stated, concealed evidence. Specifically, he had concealed the deaths of 12 enslaved individuals on his property, deaths that had resulted from conditions he had created and that he had known would kill, and he had covered it with lime and sealed it under his floor and then covered the floor itself with another floor, and he had lived in that house for 12 more years until a stroke took him. What made the documents in the hatch so extraordinary? What made them different from the private records of other plantation owners of the period, which were often callous beyond modern comprehension, but rarely constituted the kind of explicit self-documentation that Harlan Hargrove's papers represented, was that Hargrove had recorded his reasons, not clearly, not in a way that was designed for outside reading, but in the shorthand of a man keeping accounts for himself, in the notation system he used for all his private records, The reasoning was there, and the reasoning was, in its way, almost more disturbing than the acts it described. He had done it to prevent an investigation, not into the deaths themselves. He had judged correctly, as it turned out, that the deaths of enslaved individuals on his property would not, in 1851 Louisiana, attract significant official scrutiny if handled quietly. What he had feared investigation into was the reason for the deaths, because the reason was connected to something else, something that Hargrove had been doing on the property for at least 5 years before 1851, something that involved the property's particular geography, its proximity to the river, its isolated position in the parish, something that was, in the language of the period, outside ordinary commerce. The documents didn't spell it out in plain language, but Foss and Vane, working together over 2 more nights with Hargrove's private shorthand and a set of accounting records that didn't match any standard plantation operation, arrived at a conclusion that both men found they had, in some deeper part of themselves, already reached before the documents confirmed it. Hargrove Hall had not been only a cotton plantation. The river was close. The bayous extended in every direction. The house was set back from the main road and screened by trees on 3 sides. And in the years before 1851, in the records that Hargrove had kept and sealed in his private hatch, there were entries that referred, in coded but unmistakable terms, to the transit of individuals, not the transit of enslaved workers to and from the fields. Something else, something conducted at night by water, involving people who arrived at the property and departed from it again, and whose names appeared in Hargrove's records under a system of notation that was clearly designed to obscure their identities while still tracking the financial transactions associated with each one. Hargrove had been, in the years of his greatest prosperity, operating as a transshipment point on one of the domestic slave trade's most active internal routes. Not a slave market. There was no publicly known market at Hargrove Hall, but a staging location. A quiet stop on the road between the large trading centers of the Lower South, where individuals could be held, sorted, transferred, documented under false provenance, and moved on again, under cover of a legitimate agricultural operation that provided both financial camouflage and physical seclusion. And in the spring of 1851, something had gone wrong. The 12 names in Cato's journal, the 12 people whose absence had been noted in the Freedmen's Bureau records 15 years later and then quietly forgotten, had not died as a consequence of ordinary plantation brutality, as terrible as such brutality already was. They had died as a consequence of specific events connected to the covert operation that Hargrove had been running. Events that Hargrove had decided, with his characteristic cold pragmatism, to cover up rather than account for. And the cover-up had required not just the lime and the hatch and the false floor, but the deliberate falsification of the plantation's official records and the reassignment of anyone who might have had knowledge of what had happened. Cato had been one of those people. But Cato, rather than allowing himself to be reassigned, rather than accepting the dispersal that Hargrove had arranged for anyone who knew too much, had done the only thing available to him. He had disappeared into the structure of the house itself. He had hidden in the one place his owner would never look, and he had written it all down. The question of what had happened to Cato himself, where he had gone after the last entry in his journal, in the winter of 1853, was one that Foss and Vane spent considerable time trying to answer. The journal ended without conclusion, without the kind of closing statement that a man composing a deliberate document for future readers might be expected to provide. The last entry was dated by reference to a specific event, the first hard frost of the season, and described in brief and almost toneless language that the person who had been bringing him food had not come in several weeks, and that Cato was unsure what this meant. There was no final entry, no account of what had happened next. The most obvious interpretation, the one that neither Foss nor Vane wanted to arrive at too quickly, but that both understood to be the most likely, was that Cato had died in that space. That the person who had sustained him had been unable to continue. for reasons that were never recorded, and that Cato had eventually succumbed to what that space would have become without consistent provisions. The absence of any physical remains in the space between the floors argued against this. But Foss noted in his journal that the space was large enough that remains might not have been found in the areas the crew had examined, particularly given the lime that had been spread in certain sections and that would have, over decades, significantly altered the physical evidence. Alternatively, and this was the interpretation that Vane, as a journalist, found more consistent with the overall shape of the story, Cato had, at some point, left. Perhaps the person who had been supplying him had arranged a way out. Perhaps in the chaos and disruption of the Civil War, when the Hargrove property had been partially occupied by federal troops and the normal order of plantation life had been violently disrupted, there had been an opportunity that hadn't existed before. The war had passed through Tensas Parish with enough force to scramble all ordinary arrangements. And in that scrambling, a man who had been living under a floor for 10+ years might finally have found a way to walk out. There was no record of Cato after 1853, no record of a free person of that name in Louisiana. No record in the Freedmen's Bureau files, which were extensive but far from complete, of a Cato from the Hargrove Plantation. He had existed in those pages and then stopped existing, the way so many people of his time and circumstance had stopped existing without ceremony and without record. What had survived was the journal. And the journal had survived because Cato had understood something fundamental, that his survival and the survival of the document were separate things, and that the document, in the long run, might matter more. He had placed it where he knew it might eventually be found, even if he wasn't there to explain it. He had written 12 names. He had described what he witnessed and what he knew. And he had trusted, or at least hoped, that the future would have more capacity for truth than the present had. He wasn't wrong. But the path between the writing and the reckoning was, as Foss and Vane were discovering, considerably more complicated than simply finding the evidence. In the early summer of 1887, Aldrich Vane made a decision that Gerald Foss opposed, then came to accept, then came to believe was the correct one. Vane decided to publish, not in his own newspaper in Natchez. He knew, and Foss agreed, that a story originating in Mississippi about a Louisiana plantation would have a limited audience and an easily dismissed provenance. Instead, Vane reached out to a contact at a publication in New York, a weekly paper with a national readership and a history, going back to the war, of publishing investigative pieces about the aftermath of slavery in the American South. He sent them the full account. The renovation, the discovery, the journal, the hatch, the documents, the Freedmen's Bureau notation, the church record, and his own reportorial reconstruction of what the assembled evidence suggested. He did not send the original documents. He kept those, but he sent detailed summaries, extensive quotations, and a narrative account that was, in his professional judgment, as accurate and as well-sourced as anything he had published in his career. The New York paper published the piece in late July 1887. It ran under the headline, "Buried Testimony, the Discovery of a Hidden Floor and a Hidden History at a Louisiana Plantation." The immediate reaction in Tensas Parish was, broadly speaking, silence. Not the ordinary silence of a community processing unexpected news, but a specific, organized, intentional silence of the kind that Vane had anticipated, but that still, when it arrived, had a weight to it that both men found oppressive. Local papers declined to cover the story. The sheriff's office issued no statement. Alton Price, reached by letter, said only that the renovation of the property had been completed and that the documents found therein had been turned over to the relevant authorities, which was, at best, a significant distortion of what had actually happened, since no authorities had formally accepted the evidence or opened any investigation. Emmett Price responded to the New York publication with a letter to the editor that arrived 3 weeks after the piece ran. The letter was measured, polished, and devastating in its specificity. He questioned the provenance of the journal. He questioned Foss's qualifications to assess historical documents. He suggested that the so-called hidden floor was a common architectural feature of the period, a raised original subfloor, and that the objects found between the levels were consistent with ordinary household storage. He did not mention the hatch. He did not mention the documents found inside it. Whether this was because he didn't know about them, or because he had been advised not to acknowledge their existence, Foss and Vane debated for years afterward without arriving at a conclusion. The New York paper published a response, but the story did not gain the traction that Vane had hoped. 1887 was not a year in which the American public was particularly receptive to detailed historical accounting of what had happened on southern plantations before the war. The Civil War had been over for 22 years. Reconstruction had ended. The national mood, to the extent that such a thing could be characterized, was one of reconciliation, a word that, in practical terms, meant that the North had largely agreed to stop asking questions about the South's past in exchange for political stability in the present. The story ran. It was noted in several circles. It generated letters. It generated nothing official. The documents from the hatch, along with Cato's journal and the collection of objects from between the floors, were in Gerald Foss's possession for the remainder of 1887 and into 1888. He corresponded with several institutions about their preservation: a university, a historical society, a newly established archive in Washington, D.C., that had taken on the task of preserving records related to slavery and Reconstruction. The process was slow and complicated by exactly the kind of institutional inertia and political hesitation that Foss had feared from the beginning. But he kept pushing, and he kept documenting. In the autumn of 1888, Gerald Foss made a final trip to Tensas Parish. Not for work. The renovation of Hargrove Hall had been completed the previous year, and Alton Price had finally succeeded in selling the property to a family from Baton Rouge who had no particular knowledge of or interest in its history. Foss went back for a different reason. He had received in late September a letter. It had come from New Orleans, addressed to him in care of his business in St. Joseph, and it had no return address. The handwriting was precise and controlled, somewhat elderly in its quality. The handwriting of a person who had learned to form letters with great care and had not lost that care over time. The letter was brief. It said, "I read what was written in the newspaper. I have been waiting for a long time for someone to find what was under that floor. I am still in Louisiana. I am old now. If you want to know what happened to the others, I will tell you what I know. Come to New Orleans. Ask for Claudette at the French market on the riverside on a Tuesday morning. She will know where to find me." It was not signed with a name. At the bottom of the letter, in the same precise hand, there were 12 initials. 12. Arranged in 2 columns of 6. Foss read the letter 3 times. He then sat at his desk for a long time without moving. He arrived in New Orleans the following Tuesday. He found Claudette, who was a woman of perhaps 60, selling produce at the French market with the manner of someone who had been having very long days for a very long time. She looked at him for a long moment when he gave his name, then nodded, closed up her stand, and walked him through several streets of the old city to a boarding house near the edge of the Creole district, where she knocked on a door on the 2nd floor and said something in French through the wood. The door opened. The man who stood in the doorway was very old. Foss estimated 70, perhaps older. It was difficult to tell. He was thin, carefully dressed, with hands that showed a lifetime of work. He looked at Foss with the steady, patient eyes of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has made peace with the waiting. "Mr. Foss," he said. "Yes," Foss said. "I'm sorry. I don't know your name." "No," the man said. "You wouldn't." He stepped back to let Foss enter. "My name is Cato. Come in." What followed, over 2 days, was a conversation that Gerald Foss recorded in his journal with a care and completeness that went far beyond his usual professional notation. He understood, sitting in that small room in New Orleans, that he was speaking with history. Not the abstracted, documented kind of history that lived in archives and footnotes, but the living, breathing, 60-something years old kind that had survived everything the world had been able to throw at it and was now finally willing to speak directly. Cato's account of what had happened on the Hargrove Plantation in 1851 confirmed everything that Foss and Vane had assembled from the documentary evidence. It also filled in the gaps, the specific human gaps that documents and notations and marginal church records could never fully close. He described the operation that Hargrove had been running, and he described it with a specificity and a controlled fury that had not diminished in 40 years. He described the spring of 1851 and what had gone wrong, a combination of illness, a failed transit arrangement, and the particular callousness of a man whose first instinct, when faced with a disaster of his own making, was to minimize the evidence rather than the harm. He described the 12 people by name, unhurriedly, giving Foss time to write each one down. He described the woman who had taken her child to the priest. He described, without dwelling on it, what had happened to her afterward. He described, in a voice that was completely steady and gave Foss more unsettlement than tears would have, the years under the floor. "I thought I would go mad," Cato said on the second afternoon. "In the beginning, I thought the darkness would take me, but it didn't. I had the journal, I had the names, and I had the knowledge that as long as I was writing, the truth existed somewhere in the world, even if no one ever read it." "How did you get out?" Foss asked. Cato smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in 2 days. "The war," he said. "The war was many terrible things, but it was also a great confusion of ordinary arrangements. In 1863, there was a period of several weeks when the house was occupied by Union troops and June Hargrove had moved to relatives in Shreveport. The person who had been bringing me food for 12 years, I will not name her even now because she has family still living, she came to me and said, 'The house is empty. It is time.' He had been under that floor for nearly 12 years. He had emerged in the chaos of a wartime occupation into a world that was in the process of violently remaking itself. He had made his way to New Orleans. He had lived. He had survived the war, survived Reconstruction, survived the slow re-solidification of the social order in ways he had watched and understood and carried with him for 20 years before Foss's article in the New York paper had reached him through a friend who knew a man who sent clippings. "The journal," Foss said. "You left it deliberately." "Yes. You knew someone would eventually find it." "I knew the floor would eventually come up," Cato said. "Wood rots. Structures fail. Someone would come eventually. The question was only whether they would understand what they were looking at when they found it. And if they hadn't?" Cato considered this with the unhurried patience of a man who had had considerable practice with difficult hypotheticals. "Then I would have kept waiting," he said. "I have been very good at waiting, Mr. Foss." Gerald Foss left New Orleans on a Thursday morning. He spent the long ferry ride back across the river writing everything he could remember of the 2-day conversation, filling pages of his journal in the cramped, tilted handwriting of someone writing quickly against time. He arrived in St. Joseph that evening and immediately wrote a long letter to Aldrich Vane. He never saw Cato again. A letter he sent to the New Orleans address the following spring came back unopened, with a notation in Claudette's hand that said only, "He is gone." Whether gone meant departed or dead, Foss never determined. Claudette did not respond to subsequent letters. The documents from the hatch, along with Cato's journal and Foss's own extensive work journals, were donated to a Washington, D.C. archive in 1891. They were catalogued under the subject heading Plantation Records, Louisiana, Tensas Parish, 1840s, 1860s. For several decades, they sat largely undisturbed in that catalogue, consulted occasionally by researchers, but never the subject of any significant scholarly attention. Hargrove Hall was demolished in 1901, when the new owners decided that the cost of maintaining the structure was greater than its utility. The cypress wood was salvaged for lumber. The brick from the foundation and from the walls of the concealed hatch was used in a new outbuilding on the property. The original first floor, Cato's floor, the floor where the lime had been spread, the floor where 12 names had been written down in the dark, was burned. Emmett Price died in New Orleans in 1919 at the age of 66. His obituary in a Louisiana paper described him as a devoted researcher of Louisiana history and a committed preserver of the legacy of the antebellum South. No mention was made of Hargrove Hall. Aldrich Vane retired from journalism in 1903 and died 4 years later in Natchez. In his personal papers, preserved in a Mississippi archive, there is a folder marked simply Hargrove. It contains his correspondence with Foss, his notes from the investigation, and a single photograph, taken by an itinerant photographer who had been working in New Orleans in the autumn of 1888, of a man seated in a wooden chair outside a building that cannot be identified from the image alone. The man is old and very thin and very neatly dressed. His hands are folded in his lap. He is not looking at the camera. On the back of the photograph, in Vane's handwriting, there are 2 words. He waited. Gerald Foss continued to work as a contractor in and around St. Joseph until his retirement in 1907. He was known in the last years of his life as someone who would occasionally and without provocation stop what he was doing and look at a floor, any floor in any building, with a particular kind of attention that people who worked with him found difficult to describe. Not suspicious exactly, not afraid. Just the look of a man who understood, in a way that had become bone-deep and permanent, that floors can hold things, that structures can be built to conceal, that the space between one surface and another is sometimes the most important space in a building. He died in 1912. His work journals were donated to a local historical society, where they remained, largely unconsulted, for decades. The 12 names that Cato wrote in the dark, under the floor of Hargrove Hall, in the winter of 1852 or thereabouts were Henry, Dora, Sam, Louisa, Remy, Pearl, Walter, June Ann, Moses, Ada, Tom, Bess, no surnames, no ages in most cases, no records that survive outside that journal, no graves that have been identified, no official recognition of their lives or their deaths in any document created by any authority in the state of Louisiana, only a journal, only a floor, only a man who stayed behind when he could have run and wrote down what he knew and waited. The documents from the Hargrove hatch have never been the subject of a formal legal proceeding. The specific events of the spring of 1851 have never been officially acknowledged by any governmental authority, state or federal. The 12 names have never appeared in any memorial, but they are in the record. They have been in the record since the night that Gerald Foss first opened a small leather journal in a boarding house in St. Joseph, Louisiana, and read, in a careful and deliberate hand, "My name is Cato. I belong to Harlan Hargrove, and I have been in this house for 3 years without anyone knowing I am here. They are in the record, and they will stay there." What do you think happened in the spring of 1851 at Hargrove Hall? Do you believe everything about this story was ever truly revealed? Leave your comment below. We read every single one. If you found this story as haunting as we did, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten histories. See you in the next story.